Hello again, gamers and gamettes, and welcome to another episode of Not So Hardcore Gaming. I am your host, Jeremy, and today we are discussing Dark Souls 3. Now, previously on the podcast, I have spoken about Dark Souls 2, and at this point in time, I have not played Dark Souls 1, but I hope I will be able to soon, and I'll talk about that as well. But thankfully, as the games are not necessarily connected, you don't really need to play a previous game to understand the current game. So that was just a bit of a tidbit for you. And without further ado, let's get into it. So to begin with, we'll start as we usually do with visual and audio for the game. Now, visually, this is definitely one of the most beautiful games I've played. There are many different locations in the game, each which look completely unique. A lot of them will have views off in the distance, which can range from castles to snowy mountains. And they're all beautiful views to look at. And then the actual stage itself, as you go through, there's there's catacombs with bits of the wall falling down, which I always like when it has something like that, which gives you an idea of how old certain stages are and how long they've been around, because they're starting to crumble. It's always a very unique thing, and it can be done many different ways, and I always appreciate looking at it. But the sheer amount of different locations throughout the game, including the DLCs, it's very, very wide-ranged, and I've enjoyed every location that I've been to. In terms of audio, there's not as much as there are in other games. Like, there's not much music throughout the game. There's mostly just talking or sounds of the enemies that you face. And of course, you've got things like when you attack them, it'll make different sounds depending on what weapon you're using. But in the game itself, it doesn't have much, as much as certain other games will have. But it fits with the style of game it is. And I always like to recognize that even if it doesn't have as much in terms of visual or audio, if it plays into the atmosphere of the game, it's very easy to appreciate the work put into it. And for this game, same as there was for Dark Souls 2 and even Bloodborne, not having much background music throughout it, having it mostly quiet, fits with the atmosphere of the game. It would be more strange to have large amounts of music or whatever else, but the little amounts that it does have just add to it. It's like a little garnish. It's very fitting and very well done for the game. And as I said, the atmosphere, I think, is one of the most important things when you start a game, and as you go through, if it keeps you drawn in, then it's done its job correctly, and this is very good for that. Now, in terms of the enemies you face, visually, I love looking at all the different designs for random creatures throughout the levels, that they all look completely unique, and they'll either look and you think, ooh, that's an ugly little thing, or you think to yourself and you go, what the hell is that? And I'll always have that reaction. Some of them actually sent a little tingle up my spine looking at them, because it just doesn't look right. And that's, I think, what you need for a game like this, is it has to be filled with alien creatures, and it keeps you drawn in. It because they're not very human looking, you don't feel as bad when you kill them, if that makes sense. Obviously you have to, but in a game like this, because it's some ghastly beast, you don't feel so bad anymore, if that makes sense. In terms of audio for the enemies, every single enemy you have has a unique sound to them. And this is just talking about the regular enemies, not the bosses, which I will get into a little bit later. But they all look unique, they all sound unique, they'll have different attack styles. A lot of them will wear certain armors, and when they drop the armor, it's always cool to look at what your character looks like wearing their armor, and that comes into the visual part of it. Just in terms of visuals and audio from both perspectives of the stages you're in as well as the enemies you face, beautifully done. Very fitting for the game it is, and honestly, it's definitely one of the best I have seen by this particular section of the game. Very, very well done. So let's move on now to bosses. As with previous Dark Souls games, there are many bosses to face. Each of them, again, completely unique. They have the challenge of when you have to get to them to begin with, you go through all the mobs. If you die, you have to really be as flawless as you can to go and collect your souls again. And that's just getting to the new boss. And as I said, that represents a certain challenge. But when you get to the boss, they can be very intimidating. And as I said, all of them look completely unique, and I always love that. In certain games, when you reach a boss, you look at it and you feel like you've seen it before. To give an example, in God of War, you're versing different reskins of a troll like that. There's not a lot of variety, but I've found in all of the Dark Souls games, and Bloodborne as well, every single boss looks completely unique. And there is a lot of work put into the visuals for them. They all have unique sounds they make. Some of them, they make very little sound. Some make the most ghastly noises. And looking at the variety of them, it keeps you in the game. It keeps you enjoying it. And for this game, it works perfectly. And the artwork itself is absolutely beautiful. And then to give an idea as well of some of the gameplay involved with the bosses, as that's one of the most important things, all of them will have certain weaknesses you use, and that affects the gameplay. And that's a good aspect of the game, that if you use a different weapon or you use a different element to infuse with your weapon, it can make the combat completely different. It can make it easier, significantly easier, and it sort of makes way for strategy. So in terms of gameplay, the bosses are very well designed, and I will get to more in depth about the gameplay itself. But just to finish, the wide array of the bosses you face are absolutely beautiful. I love being able to verse as many as you do, and that's just in the base game. In the DLCs, it adds a couple more, and then of course you've got some bosses are one stage, some are two, and I've even faced a 3-stage boss, which was actually one of the DLCs, and that also adds a hell of a lot to it. They will look visually different between stage 1 and stage 2, even if only slightly, and then the gameplay evolves to the different stages. But again, just the visuals, the audio, I genuinely don't think they could have done any better. Beautifully done. And with that being said, we shall move on again. We'll talk about armor and weapons. Now, the reason I want to talk about this before the gameplay is this is sort of a midway point, because armor, again, it is a visual thing. While it does affect the gameplay as well, I can talk about both aspects to lead into the gameplay as a nice segue. So this is, again, another very wide range thing. The armor, there are a very large amount of different armor sets. Each of them look either, they look alright, they're very low level stuff, or they can look really, really neat. One of my favorite armor sets for this game is the Black Knight armor. Visually, it is beautiful. It's got a skull for the helmet. I always love that look. You look at it and you go, yeah, that's really cool. But again, of course, it has the gameplay aspects in it, but just from a specifically visual aspect, absolutely beautiful, wide range. And the sheer uniqueness of each one is surprising, and I find a lot of games will have issues with this aspect, that there's just not enough that you can do, that there's not enough that you can use a variety of, and it sometimes can take away from the game. But for every Dark Souls or Bloodborne game I've played, it's very well fleshed out. There is a lot you can choose from, even if it doesn't really make a major impact on the gameplay. As the best thing to do in these games is to be dodging. It does affect it slightly, and that's, I think, all you really need for this particular game is something small that makes a little bit of a difference. Even if it's a difference of one hit extra you can take, it can be a lifesaver, or it can be your downfall, and it plays into the strategy of the game. And this is definitely a very strategic game. You want to know about the weaknesses of the bosses you face. You have to be very familiar with their movesets. All of it, in the end, it comes down to strategy on one level as well as skill. And the armor can play a minor role in that, and it's just enough to keep it interesting. So that's the armor. Now the weapons. First of all, once again, massive range of weapons, and having the different types. You've got great swords, or you've got great axes. You've got just regular swords. I tend to, when I play this game, I go physical attacks, and I'll usually go for the faster weapons over the harder hitting weapons. But of course, you've got the aspect of magic. You've got a lot of magic weapons, but I personally cannot speak for those, as I don't tend to go for a magic build. But having that option is much better, even if I choose not to do it. It's always good to have that freedom to do what you would like to do, and it means if you want to experience the game almost as a whole new game, you just change what you're doing, and that's always fun. But again, you've got different types of weapons, some fast, some slow. Each will have a different attack style as well as different damages they deal. Again, it makes quite a big difference in terms of strategic play through the game. It is very well designed, and again, this one I think has a significantly larger amount of impact than the armor themselves do. But in the end, you can use the exact same weapon throughout the whole game. It won't negatively impact you, but if you want to be most efficient, changing up your style can be very, very helpful. And that I think is one of the things this game does best. As I said, armor, it doesn't affect it nearly as much. When it comes to the weapons, if you want to be really strategic and have the easiest time doing it, you want to build up different styles of weapon and use whatever will be the hardest hitting. And even if you have to look it up, like I found myself looking up weaknesses consistently, because otherwise I would have been there for hours figuring out each boss's weaknesses. But the more familiar you are with the game, the better you'll do, you know? And yeah, it comes down to choosing the right weapon, being familiar with the skill sets, and just, I get quick reaction time. You know, there's a lot of different aspects in terms of the gameplay, and the weapons affect that significantly. But moving on to the gameplay, what I found Dark Souls 3 did really very well, I found the combat was faster than it was in Dark Souls 2. I felt the Dark Souls 2 was a bit slower, and I loved the game, absolutely. And it being a slower combat, it didn't detract from the game, but I do prefer the slightly faster pace that was present in this game. Now, obviously, for a game like this, and I've used a few comparisons throughout this episode, but to use another comparison, if you compare to Bloodborne, Bloodborne is dodge, dodge, dodge. You can't block. And so I found, because I played that before I played any of the Dark Souls games, I had more of a habit of dodging. And, you know, I can't use the shield bash or whatever. I cannot parry attacks very well at all. So I tend to dodge a lot more. But being able to use a shield, it means, you know, if you're in trouble, all you got to do is block a couple of attacks, you'll be alright. Having that option evolves the gameplay quite a bit, and if you are a very skilled player, that's when you can, you know, knock them off balance and get a few attacks in, or if you stun them, you get behind them and use the backstab. That's one thing I liked, and obviously it's a similar sort of thing to visceral attacks. It's all about going at the right time, being in the right place, and it makes the combat a lot easier. You can hit really hard, really quickly. It's a good way to do things. And as I said, I dodge quite frequently, and I found it was a little bit faster than Dark Souls 2, and that, I think, made the game a lot better. And the gameplay, again, there is a lot you can do for the game. There is a lot of things that go into it which make it a little bit different. If you go magic, that's a whole new thing, which, as I haven't experienced. Having so many different things you can do means you can replay it again and again and again, and doing something a little bit different, it will be a unique experience. The gameplay is evolved really well. It is probably it received the most work in the game, and that's extremely important, because that's the most important thing when it comes to any game, is the gameplay itself. Visuals, audio, you know, the armor and weapons you have, they're relatively minor things, but you have to make the gameplay flawless. It has to be, it has to receive the most work out of pretty much anything, and this does it very well. The gameplay for the entire game is really, really well done, and I always admire the amount of work that goes into it. And the Dark Souls franchise is probably the best at it that I've seen for a good amount of time. It's very, very well done, and I cannot admire it enough, if that makes sense. It's absolutely wonderful. So moving on, we'll talk about the lore. Now, in a lot of episodes I play, I'll talk about it as a story, but when it comes to games of this type, I make the distinction between story and lore. Now, story, I find, is a different thing, because it's like current events that are happening. Like in God of War, there's a goal to make towards the end. You know what's happening, and it explains what's happening throughout the game. And that, I think, is very slightly different to games from this franchise, where what you are doing now doesn't have a major effect on current world events. It has implications more than anything, but throughout the game you have to find little notes or certain items, and you're discovering what has happened leading up to the point where your character is now. And that's the big distinction between the two. Lore is you're discovering the history, whereas story is you're making history. I think that's the best way to say it. And for Dark Souls, Bloodborne, there's a lot to learn about. You go to certain locations. It having illusionary walls, I like that aspect because it can hide a very important aspect of the story, and it can be easy to miss, but if you don't miss it, if you find it, it can explain something really crucial, and it keeps you playing for longer because you want to be able to find these things. You want to know what's happening, and because it doesn't outright tell you, it just plays further into the atmosphere. You know, you don't really know about your own past. In a lot of them, you forget about your past. So you have a goal you have to do in the game, and that's all that's important. You know, you don't have anything from your past life to remember, so you see the goal, and that's all that matters in the game. And when you find certain things, you can choose certain actions by discovering certain items that it can lead to a different ending. And that's one thing. Having multiple endings, I think it is quite good, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But the lore of the game, this specifically Dark Souls 3, I like that there isn't a huge amount of it. You know, having more of a mystery makes the game more intriguing, and it keeps you interested. Even if you don't end up learning a lot, it kind of fits with the game. It would be probably worse to have every single thing explained, you know? Having that air of mystery really plays into it quite well, and I think that this is done the best way they could do it, you know? So that's one thing I always like to discuss is, you know, the difference between lore and story. And there are fewer games that have lore than there are games that have stories. And when it has that distinction, it can make or break a game. If it's done right, it's exceptional. But if it's done wrong, it's exceptionally bad. You know, there's sort of, it's a more difficult thing to get right, but when you get it right, you really get it right. And Dark Souls franchise, for me, always gets it right. So, moving on a little bit further, we'll talk about some of the more basic stuff, which, first of all, difficulty. Now, I like to recognize the difficulty for these games because it's the style of game where 2 or more mistakes can lead to your death, you have to be able to be very familiar with the enemies, and you have to really avoid as many mistakes as possible. They can pile up quickly, and the difficulty, it's, to me, it adds a lot to the game. Obviously, you get frustrated because when one single hit can make or break it, obviously you get. Sometimes I get a little bit angry with it, but I think if it was really easy, it wouldn't fit the rest of the game, if that makes sense. The difficulty, I think, it needs to be difficult to fit the rest of the game. And I think that's, to me, that's why I am more open to it now. I never used to like the really difficult games. When I first tried Bloodborne for a bit, I remember saying, yeah, no, bugger this. But when I started the podcast, I looked at it as it's something to talk about, and I got to experience these games to really be able to talk more about it, because if I don't play them, it wouldn't be right for me doing what I'm doing. So the very first style of game I did was Bloodborne. Then I played Dark Souls 2, then now Dark Souls 3. And I've begun to actually like the difficulty in the games because it is so fitting for them. And, you know, as this is a bit more rambly, but the difficulty, it influences my opinion of the game quite greatly, and not negatively anymore. It's more of a positive thing for me now, and I think that's part of why I'm now more open and I'm more enjoying the Dark Souls. Is now that I've experienced them, I get a new liking for them. And now when I go into another game, I can play it on the highest difficulty because I'm used to things being more difficult because I played very difficult games. And another part of it, on a lot of games, you have a difficulty setting you change to make it easier or more difficult. If you're stuck somewhere, you turn it down, you can turn it back up later, however you go about it. But for these games, it's a set difficulty. There is no easy mode on Dark Souls, and it's good that way. You have your base game, then once you complete the game, you go up to stage 2, which is more difficult. And I think it has like 6 difficulty stages. And having less control over that, I think, makes it more unique. And once again, when it comes to these things, a lot of games, if you look at it and you say, oh, you can't change the difficulty, it's considered a bad thing, but for this game, it fits. And I think that's what I cannot say enough is, if it is something which other games would be worse for, if it fits, it's better. And this fits really well. Having no control over the difficulty of it is perfect for the game. Now, to finish off, obviously I want to talk about the slightly different endings. Now, once again, when it comes to this game, you don't have a lot you can say you definitely influenced on that world. You know, because it isn't so much of a story as it is lore, you see one little cutscene after the end of the game and that's it. You don't know what happened years later. So for this, it's a temporary thing, you know? And once again, very fitting for it, fits the atmosphere. it's you don't know the implications it will have later. So what you do, you don't know what happens after that, and it fits. And for a game like this, you could use it later on to make a game further down the track based in the same world. Now, Dark Souls, I don't think have done this. They're all set in a different world, and none of them really continue on later. And I think it's because they have multiple endings. You can't necessarily have a next game based off this game because of the different endings. But I like to look at it and I think, it would be interesting if they did make another one. And then they say, basically, in this world, this is what happened. It could play quite a good role for these games if they did. And as if for me, I just look at it and I think it would be cool if they did make another game, but if they don't, well, that's perfectly fine too, So I think that that's pretty much everything I have to talk about for this game. Once again, I just have to commend it for what I think it is one of the best games, and I don't really have anything I can say takes away from this game. Everything that I have experienced on it is either fitting for the game or just really quite enjoyable. Definitely, I would have to give this a 10 out of 10. I loved the game. I've already been replaying it a little bit. A day or two after I finished the game originally, I was playing it again. And that was one thing I actually meant to talk a bit more about, is replayability. For this game, I found once I finished the main story, I was kind of disappointed because I'd seen pretty much everything there was to see. So I decided to start playing it again. And that shows my opinion of it, that it immediately hooked me back in, that I was replaying it within 24 hours of finishing it. I went to a different game for a little bit, but then I found myself going back because I was in that mode of experiencing that style of gameplay. I still wanted to experience it more. So I went to New Game Plus, which was more of a challenge, and it was like starting all over again. That's my final take on it. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you have anything about this game that you would like to put forward, I have a Facebook page, Not So Hardcore Gaming. You can message me there, or you can make a post on it. I always post about the new episodes. I'd love to hear your opinions on it. If you've got any recommendations for games to play, I would love to hear it. And if you've enjoyed it, I'm very glad. I'd love to hear any advice you have on what I can do to make the show better. And without further ado, that's the end of today's episode. Thank you for listening, and I shall see you next time. Bye-bye.